The Times, Hammond, Indiana, Tuesday, November 17, 1936. Mysterious death of banker. Albert Albright, a bank official, was found mysteriously slain on a lonely road 8 miles northeast of Akron early today. He was in the back seat of his sedan with a bullet through his heart. The hand throttle had been pulled down, the machine was in high gear, and its lights still burned. The automobile had stopped after careening 200 feet along a bridge railing, breaking off the front wheels. Beside Albright's body was an .8 caliber revolver. The trigger had been pulled 3 times. The first and third bullets had failed to discharge. Authorities ruled out the possibility of suicide. Albright left his home in Massillon, Ohio yesterday morning to attend a banker's banquet in Cleveland last night. Residents near the bridge heard the crash at 11 o'clock last night. Soon afterward, the body was found. Authorities said that they could not discover that Albright had enemies, yet robbery was not a motive since Albright's money, $18, was found untouched in his purse. They believed that his slayer, after firing the shot, tossed the pistol into the car and remained on the running board long enough to push the gear lever into high and jerk down the throttle. News Journal, Mansfield, Ohio, Tuesday, November 17, 1936. OHIOAN shot, found in wrecked auto. Village mayor hears gunfire. Crash of car into span over Cuyahoga River. Murder theory scouted. Auditor met death while vehicle was running. Pistol found near body. Officials were presented today with a baffling puzzle in the killing of Albert Albright, 45-year-old auditor of the First National Bank at Massillon, which they described as apparent murder. Mayor Ross Warner of Munroe Falls, northeast of Akron, said he believed he first heard a shot, and then the crash of Albright's automobile into a bridge over the Cuyahoga River. Perplexing circumstances. Why, officials asked, was the body in the back seat? Why did he meet death while the car was moving? Why was no one seen leaving the automobile? Who pulled 3 times the trigger of the revolver found at his feet? Only the second cartridge was discharged, Dr. Amos, Summit County coroner said, joining with Sheriff James Flower in declaring that murder was indicated. They said robbery was not the motive since almost $19 was found in the bank officials' pockets. Mayor Warner of the village said he believed he heard first a shot, and then the crash of Albright's automobile into the bridge. The sheriff said the car hit a concrete abutment at the north end of the bridge, skidded about 100 feet and struck the side of the span, then skidded another 100 feet and crashed. Powder-burned shirt. Warner said he immediately rushed from his home but saw no one leaving the wrecked machine. The sheriff said that powder burns were found on Albright's shirt and underclothing. Mrs. Albright told police at Massillon that her husband left there yesterday morning driving his automobile to Cleveland on business and was expected home last night. Sheriff Flower made the identification from licenses and other papers in the victim's pockets. The autopsy showed the bullet that killed Albright entered the left side of the chest, coursing downward into the heart. Albert Albright, 46-year-old Massillon banker, was probably expecting trouble the night he was shot. It was said today by Grant Esterling, executive vice president of the First National Bank of Massillon, for which Albright was an auditor. Esterling revealed this theory in an exclusive interview with a Beacon Journal reporter today. At the same time, Sheriff Jim Flower announced that he planned to have a mysterious blonde woman acquaintance of Albright questioned during the day. The existence of the blonde woman was first revealed to Sheriff Flower at 4 a.m. today in a telephone call from a member of the detective department who had been tipped by a friend familiar with Massillon. This woman is understood to have known Albright through business connections. As these developments occupied the center of the stage in the most puzzling case to confront Summit County authorities in many a year, the services of Acting Detective Chief Vern Cross and Detective Sherman Gandy were loaned to Sheriff Flower by Police Chief Frank Boss. Another new development in this case was the report from Mrs. Saywell, wife of a Hudson druggist, that she had served Albright with a cup of coffee and 2 sandwiches, one ham and the other deviled egg, a short time before his body was found in his wrecked automobile at Munroe Falls Monday night. Mrs. Saywell said that Albright showed no signs of drinking, and that his conduct was perfectly normal in every way. Earlier reports that Coroner Amos had found considerable alcohol in the dead man's stomach were found to be in error, the amount being about that contained in one ordinary drink. Mrs. Saywell placed the time of Albright's visit to her husband's store as sometime after 10 o'clock p.m. The banker's car, careening crazily into the side of a bridge over the Cuyahoga River, attracted residents of Munroe Falls to the bridge at about 10:26 p.m. Esterling pointed out that Albright, who as an active officer of the bank had access to the bank's revolver and had the right to take it without consulting anyone, had never before carried the gun so far as anyone at the bank knew. It was this gun with which Albright is believed to have been shot to death. The fact that Albright was carrying it the night he was shot seemed to Esterling to be strong proof that his subordinate was expecting trouble of some kind. He wasn't the kind to commit suicide, Esterling insisted, reiterating his theory that Albright was murdered. What kind of trouble was he expecting? Esterling was asked. That's your question, he replied. I can't answer it. I can't imagine what trouble he could have been expecting. Esterling had known Albright many of the 31 years the latter had been in the banking business. Sheriff Flower would not discuss further what he expected to learn through the blonde woman or what connection she might have had with the death of Albright if he was murdered. While Coroner Amos clung to his murder theory but postponed giving a formal verdict until all the facts are in, the sheriff continued his investigation into the possibility that the death was a suicide as well as his probe into the possibility that it was murder. He was to go before the county commissioners today to ask for $25 to have a ballistics test made to determine positively whether the bullet that killed Albright was from the bank's gun. The gun one bullet recently fired was found at Albright's feet, and it was been presumed in 3 days of investigation that it was the death weapon. Sheriff Flower explained Wednesday night that he had delayed having ballistics tests made at Cleveland because that city was already dunning Summit County on a $25 bill for a similar test in another case. If the test shows that the bullet came from that gun, it will seem to me almost conclusive proof that it was suicide, Flower said. I can't quite conceive of it being murder with his gun, especially with the shirt opened. In Massillon, Esterling said that Albright was a timid man and advanced the theory that it would have been possible for an antagonist to wrestle a gun away from him and then force him to open his shirt, baring his bosom to the shot, so that the crime would seem like suicide to investigators. The deputies also are looking for a youth who may have been a witness to the death. This youth is reported to have boasted in a Cuyahoga Falls lunchroom that he saw a man murdered at Munroe Falls. While Flower announced that the city detectives would be asked to interview the blonde woman at Massillon as part of their work for him, Acting Chief Cross said at police headquarters that they would begin their investigation by going carefully over the scene of the crash of the car and the discovery of the body, and by examining equally carefully the interior of the car. In her home at Hudson, Mrs. Saywell explained that she had noticed Albright particularly because of his horn-rimmed glasses. She said their entire conversation concerned his order of the 2 sandwiches and the coffee. She said that she had been sick all Tuesday after seeing Albright's picture in a newspaper Tuesday, and recalling that he had been her customer of the night before. She was most positive in her identification. I didn't tell the sheriff about it right away, she explained, because I didn't think it was important. The Akron Beacon-Journal, Akron, Ohio. Monday, November 23, 1936. An anonymous tip scrawled in what appeared to be disguised handwriting today led police to investigate a theory that Albert J. Albright, mysteriously shot Massillon banker, was murdered after an argument arising from an automobile accident. At the same time, Prosecutor Herman E. Werner and Acting Detective Chief Verney E. Cross, both of whom are understood to lean toward a suicide theory, questioned the banker's widow, Mrs. Helen Albright, in Massillon. They also planned to question Albright's business associates and to attempt to determine whether there was a will and whether Albright's insurance carried double indemnity provisions. An educated person? The murder tip was contained in a letter so written as to make the police believe that it was the work of an educated person attempting to appear illiterate, which suggested that they pick up for questioning the driver of a small coach, the license number of which was given. The letter was addressed to Patrolman John Griffin, who traced the license number to a Cleveland woman. Griffin, recently promoted to plainclothes duty because of bravery in the capture of 2 youthful gunmen, and his partner, Detective James Mallon, went to Cleveland immediately to question her as to the whereabouts of the car last Monday night when Albright was killed. Sheriff Jim Flower also went to Cleveland, following an undisclosed clue on which he worked most of Sunday and until 2:30 in the morning. The sheriff refused to discuss the nature of his new lead, beyond saying it pointed to the murder theory. Patrolman Griffin has figured in the Albright case only incidentally hitherto. The text of the letter, postmarked in Akron at 7:30 in the evening on Sunday, follows. Albright I saw have accident. 3 men say he drunk. 3 men say, you go to Akron, fix our automobile. Albright say, you fix my car. Get man drive Chevrolet coach. Accident may be fault, maybe a good tip. From this note, Griffin theorized that after an accident in which Albright's car and a car containing 3 men had been involved, Albright had argued with the 3 and in the heat of the dispute had pulled the gun with which he was killed. Wrested from him. Griffin said it was possible that the gun was then wrested from Albright by one of the 3 and that this man then shot Albright. If this were the case, the killer later must have placed the body in the car where it was found and unbuttoned his clothes in an attempt to make a murder appear suicide. Prosecutor Werner's trip to Massillon with Chief Cross came as Coroner Amos announced that his formal verdict in the case probably would not be given today, as some had expected. The coroner said he had written to the companies with which Albright carried insurance. He sought that way to learn what Werner and Cross sought in Massillon, whether any of Albright's policies contained provisions paying double indemnity in the event of violent death other than by his hand, and whether they contained any clauses as to suicide. This death, Werner said as he started for Massillon, was either a clever suicide or an almost perfect murder. Besides the widow, Werner and Cross planned to question some of the employees of the First National Bank of Massillon, for which Albright was the auditor. The Akron Beacon Journal, Akron, Ohio. Monday, November 23, 1936. Was Albright murdered? Suicide? Do you believe that Albert J. Albright, 45-year-old Massillon banker, ended his own life or was murdered? Officials lean toward the suicide theory not because of any conclusive evidence, but because there are more clues to substantiate that theory than that of murder. Tremendous interest has been aroused in the case, as baffling as any printed in detective magazines or mystery novels. To give the Beacon Journal readers an opportunity to try to solve the mystery themselves, we present all the known clues in support of both theories. Murder theory. 1. No suicide motive. Those who believe Albright was slain defy suicide theorists to find any definite motive that Albright would have for ending his own life. They quote both his widow and bank officials who say they know of nothing that would have spurred the banker to shoot himself through the heart. They point out that his home life was happy and quote officials of the First National Bank of Massillon, where he had been employed for 31 years, who say he had no apparent financial worries, that his record was clear and his books in excellent shape. 2. Finding of the body. Why, murder theorists ask, would Albright pick out such a spot as the Munroe Falls Bridge to commit suicide? Why would he go to the trouble of climbing into the rear seat instead of shooting himself in the front seat? And why, they ask, was the emergency brake on if Albright was trying to kill himself in a wreck? Why would a man intent on suicide unbutton his clothes? The murder theorists are not satisfied with the explanation of why Albright's fingerprints were not found on the gun if he ended his own life after removing his gloves. 3. Albright's actions before death. Murder theorists say that all reports of the banker's actions on the day of his death make the suicide theory untenable. Mrs. Albright, convinced that he was slain, says he acted no differently from always when he left home to attend a bank auditor's banquet in Cleveland on the afternoon of the fatal day. He told her he would not stay until the banquet was over and would leave the latchkey at home because he would return before she retired. At the banquet in Cleveland, he was in the best of spirits, it was said by others who attended. He ate heartily, enjoyed the conversation at the dinner table, and asked questions at the round table discussion afterward. He inquired about membership in the Auditors Association and agreed to send the fee after a card was mailed to him. He took 2 auditing leaflets with him and they were found on his body. Although officials believe Mrs. Saywell was mistaken in her identification, murder theorists are not convinced that she did not serve Albright several sandwiches at a Hudson drugstore shortly before he was found dead. They point to her close description of the man she thinks was Albright, and ask why a man contemplating suicide would eat immediately before killing himself. 4. Albright's nature. The banker was an average, diligent, and thoughtful man who was not the type who would commit suicide or the kind who would think up a mysterious manner in which to die and possibly fool authorities into thinking it was murder, they say. 5. No financial worries? Mrs. Albright denies her husband was worried about finances. We were out where we could see our way clear. He was making extra money as an executor of several estates and had been told he was in line for more money at the bank the first of the year, the widow said. Other bank officials also discount the theory that he was financially embarrassed. They say he was cautious with his money, did not gamble, and took only a few drinks occasionally. 6. Killed by hitchhiker? Murder theorists believe it entirely possible that Albright picked up a hitchhiker on his way home and was slain by a man who was frightened away before he could commit robbery. They point out that the route traveled by Albright is alive with traffic and is frequented by hitchhikers. Mrs. Albright says her husband often picked up hitchhikers even against her wishes. 7. Killed in a fight. A mysterious letter writer today gave police information indicating that Albright may have been killed in a row arising from an automobile collision. One of 3 men in the other car, it was intimated, had fired the fatal shot after an argument over responsibility for the accident. 8. How Albright died. Albright was slain by a robber or robbers who were frightened away after taking his missing wristwatch. But before they could take his money from his pocket, some murder theorists believe. After killing him, they tried to conceal their crime by steering the machine into the bridge, abandoned it, and fled before nearby residents could reach the scene, they say. They contend the fact that the emergency brake was on indicates someone was in the front seat. Suicide theory. 1. How body was found. Shot through the heart, Albright's body was found in the rear seat of his car. His clothes had been unbuttoned so that the muzzle of the revolver was pressed against the surface of the skin over the heart when the trigger was pulled. 2 buttons of Albright's suit coat, 2 buttons of his shirt, and 2 buttons of his undershirt had been unbuttoned. Officials say it is unlikely that a murderer would have opened Albright's clothes or could have forced the bank auditor to do so himself. 2. The gun. The revolver used was the bank's property for which Albright worked, and bank officials say that although Albright was not in the habit of carrying a gun, some of their employees did so sometimes when going on trips, particularly if they were taking large sums of money. The gun was found at Albright's feet, where he logically would have dropped it. No fingerprints were found on the gun, but officials point out that fingerprints are not always found on a death gun, that Akron police equipment and methods for checking for fingerprints are somewhat antiquated, and that the gun was handled too much after being found and then covered with a cloth, shoved in Sheriff Jim Flower's pocket before being turned over to the police department. 3. Personal effects. Albright's hat was found pushed off to one side, back from his head, as if knocked off when he slumped over. A pair of gloves, believed his, were found beside the body, evidently pulled off fairly methodically, rather than hurriedly as a killer might have done. Albright's glasses were still on, not knocked off as they might easily have been if there had been a struggle. There also were no bruises on his body, or other evidence of a struggle. On the other hand, they point out that it is likely that a man wishing to make certain of instant death in suicide would open his clothing to make sure, by feeling, the location of his heart. A methodical, economical man like Albright might also rebel against the thought of spoiling a suit in which he could be burled. 4. Possible motive. Officials say Albright may have been worrying over finances. Substantiating this theory are these facts and reports. A. He was making only $200 a month at the age of 45, and he had been married 13 years and had an 8-year-old daughter. There was a mortgage on his home. B. A war veteran, he had been an objector to the payment of the soldier's bonus now and had not applied for his bonus until a short time before his death. Less than a week before he was killed, he received a bonus check for over $400 and immediately put $318 into his daughter's bank account. C. He had been forced, because of his financial circumstances, to cancel some of his insurance policies, and this fact may have preyed upon his mind. At one time, his insurance policies had totaled about $6,000. D. He was cautious about expenditures, keeping a day-by-day account of his expenses, including the amount spent on gasoline and oil for his automobile. This, officials believe, strengthens the theory that he was the type of man who would worry about money. 5. No Slayer clues. Officials make much of the fact that no robber slayer would have left the $18.91 which was found in Albright's pockets. They point out that Albright, according to his family and friends, has no known enemies who would resort to murder. They say Albright frequently went without his watch and placed no importance on the fact it was not found on the body. They cite the fact that Marshal Jesse Royer, first on the scene, ran ahead of the wrecked car and behind as soon as he got there, but saw no one leaving the scene. They point out the lack of evidence of a struggle. Why, suicide theorists ask, would a murderer kill Albright in such an open spot as the Munroe Falls Bridge, where traffic is fairly heavy, and so near a fairly well-lighted place as the Munroe Falls paper mill, instead of on a lonely side road? 6 suicides in family. Authorities are checking reports that 2 relatives of Albright ended their own lives. They point out that if the reports are true, the banker had thought about those suicides and decided upon a similar way out of any problems which confronted him. 7. Reason for mystery. Those supporting the suicide theory explained the fact that Albright was in the back seat and that his auto was wrecked on the bridge by theorizing that Albright wished to make it look like a murder because he didn't want his wife and daughter to reel the disgrace of his suicide, and he didn't want to run the risk of his insurance policies being declared void because of a suicide clause. 8. How Albright died. The suicide theorists believe that Albright either A. wrecked his car and failed to end his life by crashing through the bridge railing and dropping into the valley, climbed into the back seat, and then shot himself, or B. he got into the rear seat, leaned over and pulled down the hand throttle and guided the car with one hand while he shot himself with the other hand, and then slumped over in the rear seat. The Akron Beacon Journal, Akron, Ohio. Thursday, December 3, 1936. Albright verdict negative. Coroner raises new finance questions in death of Massillon banker. Coroner Amos issued his long-awaited formal report today on the mysterious death of Albert J. Albright, Massillon banker, reiterating in the 12-page document his belief that there was not enough evidence to support a suicide or a murder verdict, and raising 2 questions not in the foreground during the active investigation. These were, 1. Do Albright's accounts as executor of estates balance out? 2. What became of the $550 in cash that was not deposited? The answer for the first cannot be determined for 2 or 3 weeks, until new executors are appointed by the Stark County Probate Court, according to Dr. Amos. On the second point, Dr. Amos quotes Attorney Hegum of Massillon as saying, "We can account for the larger part of $100 drawn as salary on November 14th, 2 days before Albright was found shot to death in his car at Munroe Falls. He gave Mrs. Albright $50 and he had bought a few small articles. Although we cannot trace any large amount to that source, and then of course his expenses that evening and the amount found on him would come close to accounting for $100. The rest of the money, $450, we have been unable to find any trace of. The bank had no deposit on either of the 2 days, and there is no trace of it at the bank that we can find to account for it, nor do we find any other place that it might have been used. We will keep on investigating, but this sum has just disappeared." Substantiates theory. The theory of Prosecutor Herman E. Werner and Acting Detective Chief Vern E. Cross is that overwhelming financial worries led Albright to put a bullet through his heart. Coroner Amos found the $21,000 insurance and $17,400 liability of Albright, and believes these gave him fixed expenses of $210 a month against an income that Dr. Amos set at $280. Albright's stated salary was $200. $210 included premiums on insurance policies, interest on notes and a mortgage on Albright's home, taxes, and normal upkeep of his home. Dr. Amos found that none of Albright's life insurance policies were in danger of lapsing, but could not determine why Albright, on his comparatively modest income, had become so indebted to his bank. An original $13,960 note there had been whittled down to $7,900, on which Albright paid $39.50 every month. From the report, it is apparent that Dr. Amos felt that the evidence pointed to suicide, and his assistant, Paul W. Houston, confirmed this as a fact. The last 2 points made by the coroner in his conclusions before he gave the last verdict: cardiac hemorrhage, gunshot wound of heart, origin undetermined. 1. There is no discovered evidence or reason for suicide. Many points are explainable on suicide basis. 2. There are no murder clues and nobody can be placed near the scene of death by any evidence to date. The 12 typewritten pages of the report review the available evidence, familiar to those who followed the attempts to solve the mystery after the body was found, in exhausting detail. They contain 2. Criticism of the Akron Police Department's battalion equipment as antiquated, and of the actions of Sheriff Jim Flower and Marshal Jesse Royer of Munroe Falls in handling the gun before the coroner reached the scene of the suicide or murder. Pointed out for the first time is the fact that if Albright had desired to become a member of the organization of auditors with whom he had dined in Cleveland, he had enough money in his pocket to do so. Instead, he asked that they send him application blanks through the mail. Albright was on his way from the Cleveland banquet to his home in Massillon at the time he was shot. The identification of a man who stopped at a Hudson diner shortly before Albright's death as the slain banker is discredited. Dr. Amos, a reserve officer, stresses the fact that, as a battalion sergeant major during the World War, Albright would have been familiar with weapons. Cars were tested. The coroner reports, as did Werner, that tests made with unguided automobiles at the point where Albright's car was found to have crashed into a bridge over the Cuyahoga River showed that each time the car, unless stopped by the testing officials, would have crashed exactly as did Albright's. Dr. Amos indicates that Albright might have believed the crash of the car would result in its being set on fire, with the fire destroying all evidence of the shooting and exploding the remaining cartridges in the pistol which he had borrowed from the First National Bank of Massillon, for which he was auditor. The coroner will continue his investigation.